Did you know? Pokemon Gray and Z were originally part of Game Freak's master plan. For the past 3 years, we've been searching up old Japanese magazines, having them translated and digging up every scrap of information we could find about these two heavily rumored but never released Pokemon games. This video is divided in two halves, each acting as its own separate investigation, where we'll dig through source code, public filings, newly translated interviews, and connect all the dots to paint a clearer picture as we can to what happened to these two games. And of course, we'll be providing sources every step of the way. First, let's talk about Pokemon Gray, and to do that we need to go back to the early days of Black and White's development. Let's start with the initial reports. In January 2009, gaming news sites reported that 8 Pokemon games were trademarked in Japan. Pokemon Black, White, and Gray, along with Brown, Purple, Vermilion, Crimson, and Scarlet. Fans speculated the trademarks were a clue for the eventual titles of Gen 5, and they were proven correct 1 year later when Game Freak announced Pokemon Black and White in early 2010. Many of these fans expected Pokemon Gray to be announced next as a definitive 3rd edition, just like every previous generation, and it seemed they were going to be proven correct once again. In late 2011, news sites reported that the URL for PokemonGray.com has just been registered by Melbourne IT Digital Band Services, the same company who registered PokemonBlackWhite.com on Game Freak's behalf sometime before. Here's what PokemonGray.com looked like, by the way. Back then, it was just a placeholder page. As part of our fact-checking process, we investigated all those trademarks and URLs, and it turns out those gaming news sites only reported half the story. All those game titles were actually trademarked on November 18th, 2008, and the URLs were registered on the exact same day. Not just PokemonGray.com, but all the trademark titles including PokemonBrown.com, PokemonVermilion.com, and so on. Although it should be noted, they weren't able to get their hands on a few of the URLs because they were already taken. For example, PokemonPurple.com was already a fan site. We'll circle back to all the colors later in the video, but for now the thing you need to remember is that PokemonGray.com wasn't registered all by itself shortly after the launch of Black and White. As it was reported by sites like IGN, it was actually registered in 2008, along with the other trademark colors. After Black and White 2's release in Japan, Game Freak's Junichi Masuda sat down for an interview in the 2012 September edition of Nintendo Dream Magazine. Talking about Black and White's development, he explained that the 2 sequels weren't originally part of the plan, and they were initially making Black and White under the assumption they'd be followed up with a 3rd version. He said, "During Black and White's development, we were thinking about making another version, and we weren't thinking about making a direct sequel or making 2 different versions. Honestly, while we were making Black and White, we weren't thinking about making a 2 at all." If you were part of the Pokemon fanbase back in those days, you might remember hearing rumors that Pokemon Gray was going to be a 3DS game. The 3DS came out a few months after Black and White, so if Gray was going to launch a couple years later, it was reasonable to expect it on Nintendo's newest handheld and not the old DS. But Masuda said, "We wanted to make it for the Nintendo DS. We saw the 3DS was becoming mainstream, but we wanted to expand on Black and White. And the fact that so many fans already had a DS was incredibly important. The most fundamental aspect of Pokemon is that everyone could get together and have fun playing socially." Gray launching on the DS probably would have disappointed many fans, but at that point there were already 150 million DSs in consumers' hands, while the 3DS hadn't even sold 20 million. It was a no-brainer business move to just go with the system that had the bigger install base. As far as the game's plot, unlike Black and White 2, Gray would not continue N's story. In the final moments of Black and White, N bids farewell and flies off without saying where he's going. And in a post-credit cutscene, he's just seen jetting out in the distance. After you find all 7 sages in the post-game, Looker says that N's been spotted somewhere far away and that he's gonna go investigate. You never heard about him again, and what became of N is left a complete mystery. In Nintendo Dream, Masuda explains, "We originally planned to leave N's whereabouts a mystery. The interviewer presses him on it, saying, 'When I played Black and White, I thought N would definitely be in the next one, but you weren't planning on that?' Masuda replies, "Not at all. We wanted to end his story in a way that left an emotional impact and everyone would remember." Masuda was actually N's creator, and he goes on to say that even after they decided to make 2 sequels instead of Gray, he still didn't want to continue N's story. But N had become so popular with fans that they felt that they had to continue his story in the sequels. So for Black and White 2, they had him return to save Kyurem from Getsis, help you obtain the legendary dragons, then just kinda retire to his castle. But initially, the end of Black and White was meant to be the end of N. The developers never say explicitly that Gray would have been an expanded or remixed retelling of Black and White's story, but that probably would have been the case, since that's what they did with all the previous 3rd editions. Masuda would step down as director, director and let his colleague Takeo Uno direct Black and White 2, and it's probably safe to assume that if they made Gray instead, Uno would have directed that game as well. That's how previous generations tended to work, with Masuda directing the initial paired release, then handing off the third edition to a high-ranking colleague while he got to work on the next generation. In the June 2012 issue of Famitsu, Masuda explains why Uno was the right guy to continue Gen 5, saying, "I put Uno in charge as the director, and I mostly worked as producer. On earlier games, Uno was the art director. But when I looked ahead to the game's development, I thought if he was director, he could upgrade the visuals and improve everything. I know Uno was the kind of guy who works with precision, so I had a lot of confidence in him." Uno's sitting right beside him in this interview and explains his three-pillar plan to make sequels feel different from a typical third version. In other words, how Black and White 2 were different to how Gray might have turned out. Those three pillars are new protagonists, new towns, and a new adventure taking place 2 years in the future. We're inferring a little bit here, but we took all this to mean that if they had made Gray, Uno would have still been the director, but it would have had the same protagonists as Black and White, with a more similar game world, and the story wouldn't have taken place 2 years later. At least that's what we're inferring from all these interviews, because it doesn't sound like Game Freak had a fully formed plan for what Gray would become yet. It sounds more like, up until fairly late in Black and White's development, they were working under the assumption that Gray was next and had a vague idea on what it would be, but hadn't worked out all the details yet. And since we're already on the subject of details that they haven't worked out, let's talk about Kyurem and the other 7 colors Game Freak trademarked. In the middle of Black and White's production, sound designer Go Ichinose made a strong sounding cry for Kyurem. But then he was told that this form of Kyurem was still incomplete, and he should make it sound weaker. Which is why even though Kyurem looks tough, its cry is kind of a weak hiss. Here's what it sounds like when compared to its complete forms that eventually appeared in Black and White 2. According to Masuda, they knew Kyurem would have at least one fusion form in the next game, but they didn't have the concept of Black Kyurem and White Kyurem yet. As he explained, at this point in Black and White's development, we hadn't decided yet if the next entry would be numbered or if we'd go in a version of a different color. But we already had a general idea that Kyurem would play an important role alongside Zekrom and Reshiram. But if Kyurem appeared the same as before, it wouldn't really be that interesting, right? We wanted to surprise everybody, so we came up with the idea for Kyurem to fuse. But we didn't have Black Kyurem or White Kyurem at the time, just the idea that he would fuse with something. Then the interviewer asks, so there was a possibility it would fuse with other Pokemon? And Masuda replies, well, there wouldn't really be a point in Kyurem fusing with a weak Pokemon, but from the perspective of the plot, those two made sense. So it sounds like the higher-ups knew that they wanted Kyurem to fuse with strong Pokemon in the next game, but they weren't 100% certain that they would end up choosing Zekrom and Reshiram. It's pretty well known that Black and White's internal data includes an unused item called the God Stone, presumably meant for Kyurem, which is similar to Zekrom's Darkstone and Reshiram's Lightstone, except for its color, but there's something else in the internal data that's not as well known. And it seems to line up with what Masuda said about fusions. In early 2012, a fan site called PokeBeach went digging around in Black and White's internal data, and discovered a table that lists every Pokemon and how many forms they have. Pokemon that don't have any alternate forms have the number 0 next to their name, like the starters for example, while a Pokemon with 4 forms, like Deoxys, has the number 4 next to it. Kyurem is the only Pokemon in the internal data with a 1 next to its name, because 1 is a placeholder signifying that at least one new form is being considered for the next game. This same table was also found in Diamond and Pearl's internal data, with Rotom, Shaman, and Giratina being the only Pokemon with a 1, which shows Game Freak were planning to give all 3 Pokemon at least one new form in Platinum. I know this all might sound a bit complicated, but the point is, it lines up with what Masuda and Ichinose said, and suggests some degree of uncertainty from Game Freak about how many new Kyurem forms would appear in the next game. But they were definitely planning on one new Kyurem form for the next game, or more than one. The data also gives Thundurus, Tornadus, Landorus, and Keldeo as 0, which suggests Game Freak wasn't planning to give them any new forms at the time they were making Black and White. So anyway, Why did Game Freak trademark and register all those other colors in Gen 5's development? That question was never asked in any of these interviews, and unfortunately, DidYouKnowGaming isn't big enough that Game Freak will grant us our own interview. We reached out on several occasions, and even when an interviewee wanted to talk, they'd be risking their job without corporate approval. And unless you're part of the journalism elite, like IGN or Game Informer, Pokemon Corporate won't even respond to your requests. We're not part of that elite, so to connect some of these dots, we'll have to engage in a little speculation. So most fans were assuming Black and White were gonna be followed by Pokemon Gray, featuring Kyurem on the cover. But we think Game Freak might have also considered another predominant Pokemon, like Landorus on Pokemon Brown or Genesect on Pokemon Purple. However, after reading all these interviews and looking at all the trademarks, registrations, and internal data, we think it's possible they wanted to keep their options open for Kyurem to fuse with other strong Pokemon that would appear on the cover. We hired one of our favorite artists, RacieBeep, to help us out, so keep in mind these covers are unofficial interpretations based on our speculation. So for example, when Game Freak trademarked Pokemon Brown and registered PokemonBrown.com, they might have been leaving the door open for a potential fusion with Landorus, or a Genesect Kyurem fusion for Pokemon Purple, or a Victini fusion for Vermilion, Scarlet, or Crimson, since they're all pretty similar shades of red. It also occurred to us that Game Freak might have copywritten all those titles just to throw fans off of the scent on what the next generation was going to be called, so they didn't know if it was going to be black, brown, purple, gray, whatever. But we couldn't find any record of them trademarking a whole bunch of titles all together like this in any other generation, so we don't think it's likely that they were doing it in Gen 5. If they had, it makes sense that they'd employ the same strategy at some other point in the company's history. Something that stuck out to us in all these translations is that every time an interviewer asks Masuda, why didn't they make Pokemon Gray? He never says they were thinking about Gray. He always refers to the scrapped idea as another version, or a version with a different color. Whenever the word gray comes out of his mouth, it's usually to throw cold water on the color specifically. Like in his September 2017 issue of Game Informer, where he said, "A lot of people were expecting Pokemon Gray at the time, but the concept of Black and White was kind of these opposing forces, a yin-yang kind of thing. If we went with Gray, it would have moved away from that concept." Throughout this video, we've been referring to Gen 5's third version as Pokemon Gray, but we've just been using that as a title as a stand-in for the concept of Gen 5's third version. Actually, we think the other colors like brown or purple were just as likely to have been that third version, maybe even more likely. Up until fairly late in Black and White's development, the evidence doesn't indicate Game Freak had a solid plan for what came next, but rather an assumption of a third version and a desire to keep their options open. Alright, so we usually try to avoid speculation on this channel, but we decided to make an exception in this instance since there are some holes in the developers' stories, and we think they're worth exploring. So make sure to take it with a grain of salt. We'll let you guys be the judges of our analysis, but please let us know in the comments section down below which possibility you think is most likely. Okay, now let's get back to the cold hard facts and hear from the developers about why they ultimately chose not to make that game and went with 2 direct sequels instead. In Famitsu, Masuda and Uno talk about how they had ideas they couldn't fit into Black and White because of time constraints, which by the way happens in every generation, and it's a big reason why third versions even exist. But things were a little different this time because Black and White's main theme was polarity, extreme opposites, and some of those late stage ideas were a continuation of that theme. According to Masuda, every time we finish a game's development, we're left with the feeling that there are still things left unfinished. As development on Black and White was wrapping up, we were just starting to come up with lots of fun new ways to make the 2 versions more distinct. There was no way we could implement them in time for Black and White's release, so we gave up on including them even though we really wanted to. So at this point, we decided to make 2 versions of the next game, but we hadn't decided that they'd be sequels yet. When we talked to the Pokemon Company's CEO Ishihara about what they do with the next game, he said, "If it's going to be on the DS instead of the 3DS, I want some kind of new innovation added into it." It was then that we came up with the idea of numbering for the first time in the series. So with the plot set 2 years after Black and White and development time of 2 years, we felt like we wanted to add the number 2 into the titles as well. Masuda and Uno go on to say that the ideas they couldn't fit into the original Black and White were the 3 features that made up the key system. Now, for those who don't remember, the key system lets you unlock additional content by trading with the opposite version. Black 2 has an iron key that lets you open a particular door with Registeel behind it, and White 2 has an iceberg key with Regice behind it. By trading keys back and forth between Black and White 2, you can access both legendary titans in both games. For the first time in the series, Black and White 2 offered difficulty settings, but you can only unlock challenge mode in Black 2 and easy mode in White 2. So if you wanted to play the other difficulty setting in the other game, you had to trade a key from the opposite version. But the biggest chunk of content was that Black City only appeared in Black 2 and White Forest was only in White 2. By trading keys back and forth, you could unlock both locations in both games. Those were the 3 ideas Game Freak had late in Black and White's development, and it's the reason they repeatedly explained the need for 2 games instead of just 1. To be frank, and speaking on behalf of DidYouKnowGaming, we kind of feel like all the content could have just been in one game, a 3rd version, and everyone would have been happy. There wasn't really any need to lock difficulty settings and all that behind a trading mechanic, and maybe Game Freak eventually came to the same conclusion as well, since they never used the key system in any future generations. Aside from the key system, there were a couple more reasons they made Black and White 2. According to Uno and Ishihara, they wanted to surprise fans who were only expecting one game, and they really loved surprising their fans. And the final reason they made 2 games, well, probably money. Even though 3rd versions were always the best games of their generations, they were also the worst performing in terms of sales. The first 4 generations Definitive Edition only managed to sell on average 40% as many copies as the paired release they were expanding on. On the other hand, together Black and White 2 went on to sell 55% of their predecessor sales numbers, generating approximately $100 million more in revenue than they could have expected from Pokemon Gray, or Brown, or Purple, whatever they ended up calling it. Games like Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Black and White 2 were made with a skeleton crew of 10 or 20 developers, so the profit margins were incredibly high as well. Game Freak rarely cites money as a motivating factor for their decision making, but profit appears to be the subtext on quotes like this one. In the collector's edition of the Black and White 2 strategy guide, Masuda asks what inspired them to make these games, and he says, "We wanted to create a DS game to maximize how many players can enjoy the game. The platform itself was the original inspiration for a sequel to reach as many players as possible." Reading between the lines, I think it's fair to say maximizing the number of players is essentially the same thing as maximizing profits. After skipping Gen 5's Definitive Edition and being financially rewarded for doing so, Game Freak abandoned the tradition altogether. So we never got anything akin to Pokemon Z or Stars. Instead, we got Ultra Sun and Moon, which, by the way, also sold at 55% rate relative to their predecessors. Frankly, fans were getting a better bang for their buck and a better experience when every generation opened with a paired release, then closed with one big finale. But we suppose it's all a moot point in the modern era, after they switch over to the DLC model in Generation 8, so when it comes to definitive editions like Pokemon Gray, it's all just a matter of history. We're halfway through the video now. Thanks for sticking around this long. And if you're liking it so far, maybe give us a like and drop a comment down below. It really helps out the videos and lets us know if we're going in the right direction with this channel. Okay, so now let's move on to the second half of this video, Pokemon Z. Similar to Gray, it seems Z was originally part of Game Freak's master plan, but while Gray eventually got morphed into 2 sequels, Z got axed entirely, and the series skipped Kalos 2.0 and jumped straight to Alola. Why'd this happen? Well, let's start off with the official explanation, as provided by Junichi Masuda in a 2016 issue of Spain's official Nintendo magazine, that we translated. The magazine asks, why do we never end up seeing Pokemon Z? Masuda says, we never really planned to make a 3rd version, we always wanted to do things that surprise fans. For example, after Black and White, people thought Pokemon Gray was gonna come next, but instead we made Black and White 2. And the same thing with X and Y, instead we made Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. People thought Pokemon Z would come next, but taking advantage of the fact that it's the 20th anniversary, we decided to deliver another surprise with Sun and Moon. Simply put, they made a new generation instead of Z to celebrate Pokemon's anniversary in 2016. But Masuda's explanation doesn't really line up with the series' usual timeline. Looking back at the 3 previous generations, a paired release always followed up with a return to the same region about 2 years later. So if history's any guide, Z wasn't due in 2016 as Masuda suggested. It actually should have been released a year earlier. In fact, 2015 was the only year in almost a decade that we didn't get a new mainline Pokemon game. And it's not just Game Freak's release schedule that suggests something's missing, there's also data hidden inside their own games. As far back as 2014, data miners were already rooting around in X and Y's internal data and finding hints that Game Freak was working on 2 more Generation 6 games, which at the time were only known as Game 28 and Game 29. Think of it like the forms table from Generation 5's data, but instead of a list of every Pokemon, it's a list of every Pokemon game, including the ones that don't exist yet, but Game Freak plans to release in the future. When Sun and Moon launched a few years later, data miners dug in and found data for 7 unreleased games. In addition to 2 Generation 6 games, Game Freak was also reserving spots for 2 more Generation 7 games and 3 Game Boy games for the Virtual Console. Not a lot of folks were paying attention, but these guys had a pretty good idea on what Game Freak was going to do next. This is long before they'd even be announced yet. But over the next year, those reserved spots became Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, and Gold Silver Crystal on 3DS. But those 2 Gen 6 games remained a mystery and never got released. However, more information came to light when Generation 7 source code leaked in 2020, revealing that games 28 and 29 were called the Kalos Reserve. Likewise, 2 reserve spots called Alola Reserve later became Ultra Sun and Moon. Eventually, every game in the data got released, except for those 2, the Kalos Reserve games. In the data, they're placed between Oris and Sun and Moon, which means if they had released, it would have been in 2015. As we discussed earlier when talking about Pokemon Gray, 2 games are better than 1 when it comes to sales revenue, and the data reveals that Game Freak was reserving the right to do the same thing in Generation 6 that they did in 5 and 7. Game Freak don't usually decide on the names of Pokemon games till later in development, so it's likely that Kalos Reserve games never had official, finalized titles. Maybe they would have eventually called them X2 and Y2, or something like XZ and YZ, with the Z's stylized to look like the number 2, but they never got that far. Since there aren't any official titles, for the sake of simplicity throughout the video, I'm just going to refer to them collectively as Pokemon Z. Now for the big question, why didn't Game Freak take the time to actually make Pokemon Z? One big reason seems to be that they were distracted trying to make a new series that would become just as big as Pokemon. Now's the point where we need to explain the Gear Project, a Game Freak initiative that many Pokemon fans have never even heard of, but is critically important to how the company functioned in the 2010s. Back in the old days before Pokemon took the world by storm, Game Freak used to make all kinds of games like Yoshi, Mario, Wario, and Pulseman. None of them would set the world on fire, but they sold well enough to keep the lights on. But after Pokemon's first generation sold tens of millions of copies, Game Freak pretty much quit making other games and focused the studio exclusively on Pokemon. But all that changed in the Gen 5 era where they came up with a new idea, the Gear Project, which was created with the sole purpose of developing a new intellectual property. And for a while, they were so focused on making new games with the Gear Project that it took precedence over Pokemon itself. According to Game Freak's Masayuki Onoe, there are 2 different production teams here at Game Freak, simply named Production Team 1 and Production Team 2. Team 1 is fully dedicated to Gear Project, while Team 2 is for the Pokemon operation. What that means is that Game Freak as a company is prioritizing Gear Project, which is production team number 1 more than Pokemon in general. We are always trying to create something that is equally exciting or more exciting than Pokemon. We recently translated an issue of Famitsu Weekly where Game Freak's top developers explain the Gear Project in depth. The way it works is that anyone in the company can go to management and pitch a new game concept. If 2 other Game Freak devs support the pitch, the 3 of them spend up to 6 months in the planning stages to make it a fully fledged game. If they make good progress, and the plan so far looks promising, Game Freak gives them more team members and more time, and it builds from there until the game is finished. The first game conceived through the Gear Project was Harmonite. James Turner, the only Englishman in the company, didn't speak Japanese too well, so he pitched the game entirely through storyboards. Basically, it's an auto-scrolling rhythm platformer where you collect music notes and beat up on bad guys. Eventually, around 20 team members were assigned to work on it, and Harmonite launched on the 3DS in 2012. A year later, they released Project Card Jockey, where you breed horses and play a card game to win races, then later ported it to smartphones. And in 2015, the Gear Project gave us Tembo the Badass Elephant, a side-scrolling platformer where you rescue a city from an invading army. All three games got pretty good review scores, but hardly anyone bought them. That must have been quite a disappointment to Game Freak, since the whole point of the Gear project was to build a new franchise that could sell as many copies as Pokemon. Unfortunately, that never happened, and none of the Gear project games were successful enough to warrant even one sequel. 2012 to 2015 was a period of time Game Freak would have otherwise been working on Pokemon Z, but instead took a big gamble on the Gear project, a gamble that never paid off. Junichi Masuda lamented the fact in Famitsu, saying, "I'd say 1 out of 50 Pokemon fans have played them. I've tried to tell our fans, please try this one out, but the message didn't sink in. We also founded official Twitter and YouTube accounts last year. We started putting more effort into promoting these titles we've developed. So to all the fans of Game Freak, please subscribe to the channel. We actually just uploaded a video to the official channel yesterday. Please watch the video." It's worth noting that nowadays Game Freak's channel is basically dead. As of 2022, they haven't uploaded a new video in over 2 years, and the most their channel has ever had was about 40,000 subscribers. And that pretty much sums up the Gear project as a whole. They only released 2 more non-Pokemon games, Giga Wrecker and Little Town Hero, which also sold poorly, and it seems they've given up on building another Pokemon-sized mega franchise. The Gear project was at its most active in the Gen 6 era, and seems to be a significant cause of why we didn't get a return to Kalos in 2015. It's hard to say exactly how many devs Pokemon Z would have required, but according to official figures by Game Freak, they expanded their team size by 50% when they transitioned from 2D to 3D. Black and White 2 and Heart Gold Soul Silver were primarily made by 20 devs or less, so just as a rough estimate, you can expect around 30 would have been assigned to Z. Gear project games used up 15 to 20 developers each, and they made 3 of them in that era, so they probably required more resources than what would have been needed for a return to Kalos. After all, Game Freak was able to make Oris in just over a year. There were other Gear project games they started making as well, but never finished. In other words, the company had a finite amount of resources, and rather than using them on Pokemon Z, they redirected those resources to non-Pokemon games instead. And it wasn't just the raw headcount. Some of Game Freak's top talent worked on the Gear project. For example, Oris and Usum's directors both took time off of Pokemon to design Harmonite, and Masuda was the general producer on every Gear project title, while Sugimori worked as an advisor and supervisor. They didn't want to just grow a massive new IP for the extra money it'd bring in, they were also a little nervous about their current position, having all their eggs in one basket. The Wii U and 3DS got off to a rocky start, so badly in fact that some of the industry questioned if Nintendo would have to give up the hardware business altogether. After Harmonite's poor sales, the Gear project targeted the PS4, Xbox One, PC, and even smartphones as a way to put their eggs in multiple baskets. There's also the fact that Game Freak only owns a fraction of the Pokemon brand, with Nintendo and Creatures owning the rest, which restricts Game Freak both financially and creatively compared to an intellectual property they own 100%. And on a more personal level, a lot of the Pokemon devs just wanted to work on something new for a change. But alright, we've talked about the Gear project long enough. Point is, Game Freak never said point blank that their adventures with new IP was the reason Gen 6 got cut short, but reading through interviews and looking at all the data, they paint a very clear picture why 2015 was the year we didn't get a new Pokemon game. The anime shines even more light on the Z-shaped hole in 2015. Historically, new series and seasons sync up with new game releases. The first episode of Black and White's anime series aired in September 2010, the same month as the Black and White games. The second season of Black and White anime released in June 2012, the same month as Black and White 2. The XY anime and games also released at the same time. Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire launched with the episode where Mega Rayquaza made its anime debut, along with pretty much every other Mega Evolution who got added in Oris. And finally, the XYZ anime aired its first episode October 2015, which is when Zygarde's 10% and 50% forms made their first appearance, along with Zygarde cores and Zygarde cells. The anime is already out a good deal in advance, so it appears Pokemon Z was originally scheduled to launch around the same time as this episode. There's also some unused content in X and Y's internal data that suggests Game Freak was planning more for Kalos, at least at the time that those games were in development, like AZ's Floette, which has unique stats, a signature attack called Light of Ruin, and even has its own cry in X and Y's internal data, none of which ever got used. It should be noted though, all this data for AZ's Floette could have also just been evidence for a distribution event, rather than an expanded storyline. Although it should be noted that AZ's Floette can also be found in Sun and Moon's internal data, Game Freak took the time to update Light of Ruin's attack animations, despite it still being unused. The fact that they updated AZ Floette after X and Y and Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire suggests the new animation might have originally been created for Pokemon Z. But there might be some other explanation, and without more data or a statement directly from Game Freak, why they updated Light of Ruin remains a mystery. X and Y's data also has 2 moves for Zygarde, 1000 Arrows and 1000 Waves, which went completely unused in those games. A similar thing happened in Gen 5, when Freeze, Burn, and Ice Shock were found in Black and White's internal data, but didn't get added as Kyurem signature attacks until Black and White 2. The fact the same thing happened with Zygarde in X and Y suggests Game Freak was planning to do the same in Z. Z never came out though, so 1000 Arrows and 1000 Waves were first introduced in Sun and Moon instead. Zygarde only played a small role in X and Y, just sitting in a post-game cave with no connections to the story, which is basically the same role that Kyurem had in Black and White, then got a lot more fleshed out in the sequels. Fans expected a similarly expanded role for Zygarde in Pokemon Z, but that never happened. Instead, additional Zygarde content found its way into Sun and Moon. Scattered all over Alola, you have to find 5 Zygarde cores and 95 cells to make its 10% form, 50% form, and its complete form. This side quest would have made a lot more sense in Kalos, and an even bigger story tie-in like Kyurem got seems to have been hinted in X version's Pokedex, which says, when the Kalos region's ecosystem falls into disarray, Zygarde appears and reveals its secret power. Other areas Z could have expanded on is the mysterious locked door on Route 13 and all the buildings behind it, which can be seen but never explored. And a few more Mega Evolutions. Ken Sugimori said that they tried to make Mega Flygon but couldn't finish the design. Now for the big question, how far into development did Pokemon Z actually get? Not far it seems, as there's no evidence any code ever got written. This video would probably be a lot more interesting if we said maybe it was half finished, and that the Zygarde side quest Core Enforcer Z moves could have all been taken from a scrap build to Z and copy pasted in Sun and Moon. It's likely that some ideas got repurposed, but looking through Sun and Moon source code, everything Zygarde related appears to have been written from scratch. There aren't any large chunks of code copy-pasted from an unfinished version of Pokemon Z, or at least there's no evidence that's been discovered. There are millions of lines of code, and thousands of different versions of them. A lot of it hasn't been combed over thoroughly, so it's impossible to say with 100% certainty that none of it came from Z. Data miners have been digging for years though. Actually, while this video was getting made, one of the data miners we're working with found a distribution event for Sinnoh's Zygarde that got deleted from Sun and Moon. New things are still being discovered, but so far nothing to suggest there's a half-finished Pokemon Z sitting in a vault somewhere. With all that said, there's probably more to the story than what we've laid out here. Game Freak's adventure with the game project and the new IP had its consequences, but it's probably not the only reason we never got Pokemon Z or XZ or YZ, or whatever they would have ended up calling them. Maybe personal interests or office politics were at play, or Game Freak wasn't all that enthusiastic about Kalos in general. We'll probably never get a full and official explanation, so even though we've connected a lot of dots and data points, it'd be irresponsible not point out that there are almost certainly a few dots we couldn't find in our research. Aside from the sparse data points and leftovers and inferences based on series history, we'll probably never know what Pokemon Z might have become. But that hasn't stopped fans from dreaming. Almost a decade later, people are still asking for a return to Kalos, and it seems less and less likely with each passing year. But who knows? Maybe someday Pokemon Z will become DLC for the inevitable Gen 6 remakes. Did you know that Pokemon Coliseum's devs didn't know anything about Pokemon? For more on that, click the video on screen. And hi, I'm Austin John of the YouTube channel Austin John Plays. I've actually been a big fan of DidYouKnowGaming for a long time, and I'm really excited I got to do a voiceover, and great. Also, special thanks to all the people who helped make this video, like HiResPokemon, Jacob Newcomb, SnorlaxMonster, Lewtwo, RacieBeep. Thanks guys. Okay, bye!